Okay, welcome everybody. Now we're going to have a panel discussion, and the topic is the Tibetan Empire, Buddhism and beyond. So we thought we'd have this discussion panel to spend a bit more time talking about the Tibetan collections from Dunhuang, because they are roughly about the same in number as the Chinese collections from Cave 17. So there's several reasons behind that, but the main thing is the huge success and influence of the Tibetan Empire. I'll ask Lewis to introduce the empire and its the sort of context of the empire in a moment, but to say a little bit about the study of the Tibetan manuscripts from Dunhuang. There's been historically, because of academic specialization, there's been a bit of a study of the Chinese manuscripts falling into the camp of sinology and the Tibetan manuscripts into Tibetology, and not quite enough kind of study of the different languages alongside each other, despite the fact that in the manuscripts we often find Tibetan and Chinese on either side or line by line, all interacting closely with each other. So in more recent years, and some of the people here on stage with me today have worked on this, there's been a lot more work on that kind of interaction. Another thing with the early study of Tibetan manuscripts from Dunhuang was that they were taken really as a way of a kind of window onto the early history of Tibet. So onto the Tibetan Empire in central Tibet, on the tempos, the emperors, the early pre-Buddhist religion, sometimes referred to as Bon, and the earliest kind of Tibetan assimilation of Buddhism. More recently, as with the Chinese manuscripts, there's been a kind of more of a focus on Dunhuang as a local place and the kind of day-to-day life of people at Dunhuang, and their interactions more locally in Central Asia have been more of a focus. So we'll look a bit at that as well. And finally, hopefully we'll have time, but I just wanted to, at the end of this, also to bring us to the present and really to focus on the fact that the Tibetan Empire wasn't the limit of the Tibetan influence at Dunhuang. In fact, it was just the beginning, and it carried on through the 10th century and beyond that, after the closing of the cave, well into the present. And that when Stein arrived at Dunhuang, he was actually met by Tibetan monks before Wang Yuanlu was out of town and shown around the caves by a resident group of Tibetan monks. So there's a continuity there that it's worth thinking about as well. So we've got our slides running, great. So I'll ask Lewis first just to sort of introduce the Tibetan Empire to us, and just to kind of maybe just tell us a bit about how it reached Dunhuang and why it was so influential in Central Asia.
Okay. Thank you very much. So as we go through this, perhaps there'll be pictures scrolling behind me. I won't know what they are, but one of them should be a map of the Tibetan Empire as it was at its greatest extent, which was during the 8th century. So during the early 7th century, around the Tsangpo, the Brahmaputra River, down in the south of the Tibetan plateau, we have a dynasty, the Yarlung, who formed connections with other nomadic pastoralist groups and expanded out. And especially under the emperor, the Tempo, Songtsen, Trisongtsen, or Songtsen Gampo, they expanded out into other areas which didn't necessarily share their language, their culture, or their ethnicity, and especially by the end of his rule in the middle of the 7th century into the Silk Road. And this was by treaty, by military campaigns. The areas on the Silk Road which they took over, for example, Khotan in the west, or the Asha, the Tuyuhun, more in the east, were not necessarily destroyed in this process, they were incorporated into this growing empire with an emperor at its head. And some of the documents that we have in the exhibition, for example, the old Tibetan annals, show that the emperor was really at the center of kind of time and space. The old Tibetan annals mentions as a dating formula where he went around his empire and connected with the different groups that showed him loyalty. So this expansion carried on into the 8th century, and especially under the Yarlung dynasty emperor Trisong Detsen, we reach the greatest extent. In 763, indeed, they even briefly conquered Chang'an, the Chinese capital, put an emperor on the throne, but then retreated several days later. So they were a thorn in the side of the Tang at this time, and soon afterwards they had a number of treaties which gave certain powers to Tibet and made them in some ways kind of equal in some terms with the Tang dynasty. So as part of this expansion, around this time they took over Dunhuang. We're not entirely sure when that was. Some people have suggested the 780s. More recently, Bianca Holloman in 2002 has argued for sometime in the 760s. So that's a whole decade earlier, which perhaps there were growing connections. And she suggests that, in fact, Dunhuang was first attacked on the way to Chang'an rather than afterwards. And this was part of the expansion into the Silk Road and then down south towards Tang China. So yes, once they'd taken this area, they then had over a century of rule and growing kind of Tibetanization of Dunhuang, which was a multi-ethnic place.
Great. One of the kind of, especially from the time of the Emperor Trisong Detsen, as you mentioned, one of the real impacts that the Tibetan Empire made in Dunhuang was via Buddhism, in the sense that we have a huge sutra copying project, which Channa will talk about in a moment. But the Tibetan Empire adopted Buddhism as an official religion. Can you tell us a bit about sort of why that happened and how it shaped the empire after Trisong Detsen?
Yeah. So when the empire expanded into the Silk Road, they met a number of different states where Buddhism was already important. For example, Khotan, or amongst the Aja. So it's possible that this kind of Buddhism was part of the diplomacy on the Silk Road with the expanding Tibetan Empire. In the 7th century, under Songtsen Gampo, there were connections with China and also with Nepal. And the first kind of moves towards the Buddhicization of the Tibetan Empire started then. But it's really, as you say, in the 8th century with Trisong Detsen, that a very large monastery named Samye is then built in the heartland of the Yarlung Empire, and there an edict is written on stone saying that from then on the emperors will support Buddhism. And so this may have been around the 760s, 7th centuries, right at the time when they were entering Dunhuang. So they came with a very positive idea of Buddhism, and they connected with the Buddhist clerics in Dunhuang especially, helped to spread the education through Buddhism in the temples, and made life easier for Buddhists. So this helped to kind of cement relations between the people of Dunhuang and the Tibetan Empire.
Now, some of Lewis's recent work is touching on that theme I was mentioning of looking more at the kind of local activity at Dunhuang rather than it just as an extension of the empire at the time. And you've worked a bit on, I think, rather than just monks in Dunhuang kind of responding to edicts from the empire about their own kind of agency in terms of what we see in the manuscripts.
Yeah, that is definitely true. There was an imperial regime, so part of that was bringing various texts like laws and history, some of which we see in the exhibition, and ruling either directly or indirectly the Dunhuang people. They were split into a civic group who were relatively unaffected, and then a military group who would do corvée labor and other things for the empire, who were more directly under control. And this included monks and nuns, and so some of the monks and the lay people were part of projects like, for example, the copying of multiple sutras, Mahayana sutras, like the Prajnaparamita in 100,000 shloka, the Bum or Shatasahasrika, also Dharani texts like the Aparamitaya Nama Sutra that I've been working on recently. And these scribes were then employed there, but they also were under strict regulations. So there was corporal punishment. For example, the paper that they were given, if it wasn't given back, they could be given 10 lashes for every piece of paper. And then this, we think, created some kind of black economy in the Dunhuang area where people would write sutras on behalf of other people. And one of the, in fact, here we see the name of one scribe crossed out and another one put in their place. This might have been quite an open black economy because they didn't do much to hide it. But this was part of the kind of working within the imperial framework. One way, again, of mitigating this was to make a kind of a connection as a Buddhist to the emperor. So we see in the edges of some of these sutras prayers offering long life and saying that this is an offering for the protection and health of the emperors. So in that way, these quite lowly scribes on the periphery of empire could kind of connect directly to the emperor and in some ways mitigate their situation.
Great. Well, I'll turn to Channa because you've worked quite a lot on the scribes and the sort of, especially around that intersection of Chinese and Tibetan, both people and languages at Dunhuang. And you've worked, especially there's one sort of celebrity at Dunhuang, the translator Chodrup or Fachang in Chinese, who was known before the manuscripts were discovered as probably the main translator of Chinese Buddhist texts into Tibetan in the Tibetan canon. After the discovery of the manuscripts, we found that actually the place that he worked was Dunhuang. So could you say a little bit about Fachang and then also a bit about your work on the importance of the translation of and what it tells us of Chinese Buddhist texts at Dunhuang?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I want to start by by introducing a little bit about the Tibetan translation projects of Buddhist texts in imperial time. In imperial Tibet imperial time, there are fast translation projects to introduce or to translate Buddhist scriptures into Tibetan. The majority, most of them, were translated from Sanskrit into Tibetan, as we expected. And we know that one of the earliest are Mahamegha Sutra or Lankavatala Sutra. Apart from that, there are also a large number of texts translated from Chinese into Tibetan, especially in the earlier phase. And those translations from Chinese were unfortunately lost for a majority part lost in history, so we didn't know it. Then how we know that there existed so many translations from Chinese? Before the discovery of Dunhuang, we have early imperial catalog. And in imperial catalogs, we read there are special sections on translations from Chinese into Tibetan. So we know lots of them. And then we compare them with what we have now in Kanjur, in the Tibetan canon. We found many of them are not there. We couldn't recognize them. So we know that they were kind of lost in history. And fortunately, 1,000 years ago, somebody sealed the cave, and tens of thousands of manuscripts were sealed there, preserved there. And then we discovered there many Tibetan translations indicated by their catalog, translated from Chinese. And more remarkably, many of them actually were attributed to one translator, that is Samdrup, and his Chinese version is Wu Facheng. Without the discovery of Dunhuang manuscripts, Facheng remains just a trivial figure. We don't know him. We just know in Tibetan Kanjur, he translated this text, that text, and there are no biographies. There are no more historical information about him. But based on Dunhuang manuscripts, we know that he was very proliferate translator. I'm definitely sure there were more, 23 translations from Chinese. And there were also several directly, he translated from Sanskrit. So I think he's not only bilingual, he's trilingual. His Sanskrit must be of high level. And then even more interesting is we find he translated also from Tibetan into Chinese. But those translations into Chinese were not transmitted to central China. So in Chinese Tripitaka, Dazhengzang, or Dazangjing, we couldn't find them actually. We only find his translations from Tibetan into Chinese in Dunhuang. And based on the colophons of the manuscripts, and also based on eulogies and other information from Dunhuang, we also know that he was a very esteemed and respected monk, Buddhist monk. He was addressed as the overseer, almost the leader of the Buddhist monastic communities. He is also, as in my publication about him, I also argue he is not only a translator. Translator just define one aspect of his monastic career. He is also a scholar, and in this person we find diverse ideas and doctrines transmitted to him, and then from him there are more commentaries or more works there. So he kind of combined many traditions of Buddhist thoughts and then sparkled, the later development.
So one of the really exciting things about Samdrup is that I discovered a while ago because it was a work done by a Japanese scholar, Daishun Uyama.
Yeah, here.
Oh, this is
That's just a classical, yeah.
Perfect synergy.
Yeah.
It worked for Lewis and it worked for you.
Yeah,
Okay.
But that's for mine.
Yes, so exactly. Who I think was the first person to say that some of the manuscripts were actually in the handwriting of Samdrup.
Yeah.
And you've done a bit more work on trying to identify a larger corpus.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, that will leads me to my coming project about using machine learning to categorize or grouping Dunhuang Tibetan manuscripts based on their handwritten style, based on their scribes. And why we, for this study, we have very good foundation because based on previous scholarship, such as Ueyama's work and also your work, we have 10 manuscripts that we are kind of sure they were written by Tsering or by Tserin's intellectual group. That means even if this is not Tsering who write this thing, it must be written by someone who related to him, who inherited his ideas, who developed his tradition. So you can call this was his handwriting. And since we have more than 10 manuscripts containing the same style of handwriting, and also we have semantic connection. That is, we know that they all about, for example, Yogacara Bhumi Shastra, about Yogacara. There were many of them are translations, and also we have many of them with very explicit colophon, saying that Tsering write this piece of composition, piece of work. So we have a very solid database or benchmark, and then we try to build this kind of model to recognize more manuscripts written in this handwriting. And then we might find more manuscripts with this handwriting that we before didn't know they were related to Tsering. And then it's potential that we find more works about him.
And this is a kind of computer-based model.
Yeah.
Using kind of AI text recognition.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating, but yes, we're waiting for the funding still. So you mentioned, and Lewis has mentioned the sort of a bit about the lives of the scribes, and I think some of your work has also been like more about fleshing out their education and kind of other practices. So can you say a little bit about that as well?
Yes, I'm waiting for the other manuscript. Can I choose?
You can try. Yeah.
I can try.
Oh, that's the link.
Yeah, this one. I think this is a very big question, and due to the limit of time, I think I will just use one case to show, how in Dunhuang, in this bilingual studying environment, how they carry out some learning or lecture, or how they prepare for lectures. You see here, this is ITG3 in British Library, and this is two sides of the same manuscripts. And on one side you have Chinese written in red, and then on the other side you have Tibetan, written in a very cursive, small, and unrecognized way, very painful to read. And I'm going to, based on my research, these two actually are semantically connected. They are both Mullah Sarvastivada's story about the marriage between Prasenajit and Malika. So both Niwang and Sheng Manyu, their marriage. And you can see, based on the style of writing here in Tibetan, we see this was not supposed to be written for circulation. It's not written to be read by others. It's written by the writer himself. And the whole content is not just copying, but a kind of summary. So he summarized something from this Vastu, from this section of Vinaya, and then the other summary of another story from the other section of the Vinaya. And then you have the whole collection. In my theory is the scribe write this to prepare for preaching or for lecture as kind of lecture note. And what we also know here is when he is trying to preach, his audience were bilingual. Yeah, they know Chinese, they know Tibetan. And for the scribe, he must he must have mastered by language, the two language, Tibetan and Chinese, and he also must have been very familiar with each text, like the parallel of the same text in two different linguistic versions. Yeah, so that's kind of way.
Great, yeah, thanks. So I think, as you've mentioned, there's at least a couple of social contexts around it. There's preaching, and there's sort of learning as well. So there's clues in all of the manuscripts about the reason they were written in the first place. Did you want to say something about?
Oh yeah, this one. This one gives us very special case of translation in Tibetan text.
Which is in the exhibition, by the way.
Yeah, this is very famous bilingual manuscripts of Lankavatala, Lanka. And we see here this Tibetan in red. My hypothesis is this Tibetan is written trying to help the, okay, let me show you another, because it's, if you don't have this. Okay, let me try to simplify the situation. Before the translation, there were two Tibetan translations of Lankavatala, of this text. One translation is earlier from Sanskrit, as I mentioned before. And sometime, later, sometime in history, the Dunhuang monks, they think, okay, we need a new translation. And so they translate a new Tibetan version of Lankavatala from Chinese based on this text. This text is a commentary on Lankavatala text. And how they do the translation? They translate the whole commentary. And because in commentary, there are root text and then explanation of the root text. So you have the root text there. And the translators, when retranslate this text, they find, okay, this root text was translated as that in previous Tibetan translation. And they write it in red. So these red Tibetan lines were translations from previous version. And then they try to revise this red translation according to Chinese. And then they delete all the commentaries, preserve the root text, and then we have the second translation of Lankavatala from Chinese.
Great, yes. It's a really fascinating manuscript, and it looks lovely in the exhibition as well. Okay, so thanks, Channa. I'll turn to Tsering now. So we've been looking at manuscripts from the period of the Tibetan Empire. In fact, the majority of the manuscripts, Tibetan manuscripts from Cave 17, are from after that date, from the middle of the 9th century through to the closing of the cave in the early 11th century. So, Tsering, can you say something a little bit about the reason why the Tibetan language continued to be so popular and in Dunhuang and across the Central Asian region?
Sure. Yeah, the early scholars of Tibetan studies, they were interested in the empire, as Sam already mentioned. So they were not really looking into the social texts that has been started looking at by scholars like Gezo Ore and Takuyuchi, Gezo Ore from 1980s. So they found out that most of the texts were actually produced in 9th and 10th century rather than during the imperial period. So this has something to do with the popularity of Tibetan after the post-Tibetan rule of Dunhuang has something to do with the popularization of Tibetan language during the empire. We can see from numerous documents that there were people with different ethnic backgrounds copying sutras and using the Tibetan language for their own daily purposes, and also Tibetan Empire was using as a kind of administrative language during their rule. And so even after the fall of the Tibetan Empire and Tibet's rule over Central Asia ceased, and Dunhuang fell into the hands of Guijun, the people there had to have a common language to communicate with each other, and even the rulers had some kind of a language that is useful for everybody. So since everybody learned Tibetan, people with different ethnic backgrounds learned Tibetan before under the Tibetan rule, so naturally they turned to Tibetan as a language of communication, like kind of lingua franca. And that's how Tibetan became the communication tool for different ethnic ethnic people in a multi-ethnic Dunhuang. And it's not only used for like everyday common communications, but also for like high official purposes. For example, we have a letter, I don't know if we can find it from here. Oh no. But yeah, there was a letter that was written in Tibetan between Han administration in Dunhuang and the Uyghur state established in Ganzhou, a certain Kagan from the Ganzhou area. And so these people spoke different languages, and so using Tibetan as the common language to communicate each other. And another significant reason for the use of Tibetan by various groups in the region is that Tibetan Buddhism continues to thrive in the region, and as Tibetan Buddhist practitioners, Tibetan serves as a crucial language for them to practice the religion. Consequently, in the 10th century and in Central Asia, Tibetan became this international lingua franca, used by many people.
So the other aspect of this question, which your work has been on, is Dunhuang's kind of situatedness in a Tibetan cultural area. Mm-hmm. And you've looked a bit at this, I think, in terms of linguistics or phonology, whether the Dunhuang documents reflect a kind of the Tibetan of Amdo, of the sort of, which is sort of roughly in the Qinghai region of China, or whether they're more of like an extension of the Tibetan of the empire based in central Tibet.
So, in short, Old Tibetan texts were from Dunhuang are written in Old Tibetan, so not in any modern varieties of Tibetic languages. So, Old Tibetan is precursor to all the modern Tibetic languages. So, we cannot say like it's close to this variety or that variety of Tibetic language. As we know that Old Tibetan, probably based on the speech of Yarlung Valley, people of Yarlung Valley, and then spread to the Tibetan Plateau and even into Central Asia. And along the way, there were people who were not native Tibetan speakers. Probably Asha probably spoke some kind of Mongolic language, and Xiangshong and Samba probably spoke some kind of Tibeto-Burman, but maybe not Tibetic. But they became kind of native speakers of the Old Tibetan, and we, through these orthography of Tibetan and Old Tibetan texts, we have fairly good understanding of features of Old Tibetan. And but modern Tibetic varieties read the Tibetan text differently. But by the Old Tibetan, when in the 9th century, when Tibetans came in term with Chinese by erecting a stele in Lhasa and all that, from the inscriptions we can, we have.
Carry on.
So from the inscriptions from the stela, that Tibetan language, even old Tibetan language, had already shifted from the written language back then. We have the bilingual text there that is evidence that we lost the consonant, enclitic consonant R, but S is already pronounced, but R is lost in this inscriptions. So we are pretty sure that Tibetan language was changing back then, and Amdo is no exception. So if we know, like, look at the Amdo Tibetan now, we introduced a new middle vowel schwa into the language, but unlike Central Tibetan, where they have more vowels, probably 8, and Amdo has 5. And but Amdo didn't lose the last consonant in the consonant cluster, but Lhasa lost it. But Lhasa introduced tonal system, but Amdo didn't. So in that case, Tibetan, it is safe to say that Tibetan, the language of Tibetan documents from Dunhuang, Old Tibetan, is distant from Amdo Tibetan, as from any other modern Tibetan varieties. And they have each developed independently, the modern varieties of Tibetan, over the centuries, and undergoing distinctive phonological, morphological, and syntactic changes. Like Amdo Tibetan have a complex system of pragmatics developed, like hieroglyphics developed later, which is not present in other languages. So it's very difficult to say about the conservatism that is prevalent in Amdo and not in others. So it's difficult to say, like, yeah.
One of the things, we'll probably wrapping up soon, but just before that, one of the things that really interested me, and I ended up writing on it with Imre Galambos, was some letters of passage of a Chinese monk who was traveling from Wutaishan on the way to India, but via Dunhuang, and through that Qinghai, Amdo region. And the letters of passage written by local officials for him were all in Tibetan, despite the fact that he was Chinese and he was heading towards Dunhuang and beyond. So it was clear from that, and this was in the 970s, that vast areas around Dunhuang were still under Tibetan rule and were used, at least one could say, the Tibetan language was the language of the rulers. So in that sense, that's something that we can see continuing through the centuries that followed, basically. Could you briefly say something about, like, the kind of continuation of that Tibetan influence in the region?
Yeah. The presence of Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan language in the Heshi corridor has never disappeared, like, entirely throughout the past 1,000 years. So actually the 19th century text, Tibetan text called Dormet Chunjong, or the Oceanic book, talks about the history of Tibetan Buddhism in Amdo and parts of Heshi corridor, actually. It mentions a lot of monasteries there and Tibetan Buddhist monasteries there, and even like prominent religious figures hailing from those monasteries and their close connection with the other Tibetan Buddhist world. So it's from 19th century, but we know, like, famous stories of Sakya Pandita and Palpa in Liangzhou, and even Third Panchen Lama and a certain Karmapa were active in the region in the probably 13th. Karmapa was in the 13th, 14th century, and Third Panchen Lama in the 15th, 16th, 17th century. So today we only have, like, small number of Tibetan speakers in the Heshi corridor, but those were consisted of, like, Ndongnar and some other Kama Loksoa. Actually, there's a study of the language of Dunhuang by a Chinese linguist named Shao Mingyuan. And he says that the Tibetan language is considered as an endangered language because there are only like less than 100 speakers in each town, or sometimes in an entire county. Only people who are over 60 years old can speak the Tibetan. So there are continuously Tibetans lived there, and there are still Tibetan Buddhist monasteries there, but with very few number of monks, and usually they have some monks from the other regions of Tibet living there. So the Oriel Stein, when he went there, when he met the monks, I don't know if they're itinerant monks or like who are they residing in one of those areas. But the text I mentioned from the 19th century, it mentions the eastern part of the Heshi corridor, but he doesn't go beyond Jiuquan and to the west. So we don't know much about the activism, Buddhism and language situation and all that there, but he talks about hundreds of patrons for the Tibetan monasteries there with Tibetan tribes with Tibetan Toa with Tibetan names, and sometimes they were Uyghur patrons, but most of them were with Tibetan names. So I assume that these people spoke Tibetan back then, but now we only have a handful of Tibetan-speaking people along the corridor. But we have a lot of people in the southern part of like Jelarchu, like Huari and Dzongkha region. We have more Tibetan-speaking people, and these monasteries in Heshi corridor, they have strong connections with the Gelu monasteries in the Dzongkha region, and so yeah, it's still there, the connection and the situation is.
Thanks. That's fascinating. Well, I hope that's given everybody some idea about the Tibetan Empire, about the contents of Cave 17, about how that influence continued, and about how it's, in some sense, never really gone away. Thank you to my wonderful panel. Everybody's been really fascinating. I've loved that. We now have a little bit of time for questions, I think. So we can take some from the room.
Might we go back to the slide 2 before Thangalai and Steely? The photograph of the monk. It'd be the next one. Yes. Oh, yes, okay. Now I was mistaking it for another one, which was taken by Nuet of a monk at Dunhuang, which is very interesting because it has 2, if not 3, of the paintings that eventually were in the Pelio collection, which were being used in a ceremony by a monk, possibly Wang Yanlu himself, I don't know. But one mystery about the Pelio collection is that so many of the paintings are in excellent condition, presumably because they were created shortly before the sealing up of the cave that was once dedicated to Hongbian in the 860s. Thank you.
Yes, it's that photograph is fascinating because, as you say, it seems to show a ritual being performed as well. And I think Tsering was saying we weren't sure whether the Tibetans that Stein mentioned are itinerant or resident, but I think he says there was a group of resident monks, but we also have lots of accounts from others, missionaries, about pilgrims. So there seems to have been a lot of both. But as you say, the photograph by Nuet seems to show not only a resident Tibetan, but somebody who's actually using somehow some of the collection that we know as the Paleo, or what's in the Gime now. So it's really fascinating, but a bit of a puzzle.
Dr. Li briefly mentioned about the approach of using machine learning. So I wonder if anyone on the panel would like to comment about how computational approaches might be helpful or may not be helpful in this area.
Please.
Can you, I didn't hear the keywords. Can you repeat your question? You mean which
I just mean in general computational approaches, how can
computational
be helpful,
approach.
not helpful?
Of course. I would say, I would take my current project as example. I don't know whether you know, there is a kind of handwritten manuscript website called Transcribus. And it's try to transcribe using AI those handwritten manuscripts, not the printed one. And they are quite useful actually, because you can do things in a quantitative things, in a quickly way. But when I try to use Transcribus to transcribe Dunhuang manuscripts, they have some trained models. I have to correct every page, not every page, but every line. So it's still lots of work. But you can do some quantitative things in kind of imagined limited time. So it improves your pace. But you have still, invest lots of time as a human expert, to retrain the model, and this continues. So for that project, this is kind of plan. It's definitely helpful because as a human expert, you are more subjective. When you are more familiar with one kind of handwriting, you see the other manuscripts, you will find, okay, similar, so similar, that is also similar. The criteria to judge is kind of subjective. The other thing is you cannot manage, tens of thousands of manuscripts. You can manage 10, 20, 30, but not more. So for that kind of amount of manuscripts, you must use computer to help you to do something that without computer you cannot do. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. Any other questions?
Hi, thank you for the talk. And you have talked about extensively on the how religion's knowledge has been traveled and exchanged. I'm wondering, since we're talking about Silk Road, is this how the trade and the commodities exchanged within Tibet? Because we talk about Khotan, we talk about Heshi Corridor, but they are all the external areas of Tibet regions. I'm wondering what is happening internally? Is it they all go to the emperor and then emperor distribute all these trade and communities, or there are different ways of people, caravans doing the trading?
I'll try and make a start on an argument. There is very little information about how it works within central Tibet. The areas like Khotan, the Tarim Basin, Dunhuang are a part of the empire, but they are, as you say, not the central part. We have certain information about the center of the empire, for example, the Old Tibetan Annals and the Old Tibetan Chronicles, but they are written from the perspective of the court. And so they give a certain kind of narrative, and they are interested in certain things and not interested in other things. What's wonderful about the Dunhuang cave corpus is it really tells us about everyday life in places like Dunhuang and other places along the Silk Road, and it can tell us about trade, it can tell us about interactions, it can tell us about daily asymmetrical power relations. But then we have to question to what extent that can be considered applicable to the center of the empire. And that is something that we have to we have to do a lot of careful reflection on. So Dunhuang is a fascinating place, but at this time it's not a minor Tibetan city, just as it's not a minor Chinese city. So it has its own environmental kind of effects and influences, which are only in a limited way applicable to either of the main kind of power centers of the Tang or the Yalong dynasty at this time.
Any other questions?
There's one question online, which I'm not sure any of you will be able to answer, but maybe. Are there Tibetan monasteries in Mount Wutai or Taiyuan today?
Any ideas?
No. Never visited. No. Sorry. Okay, there are. From Professor Liu in the audience, there are, but yeah, so maybe you can send her an email. She'll be able to give you all the information you need.
I think that was it from our audience online. But
Okay. In that case, thank you for listening. Thank you, panel, for this engaging discussion.